Now, with the war in Ukraine continuing, the United Nations General Assembly has passed a resolution in support of Ukraine's sovereignty. The resolution also called for a full ceasefire and lasting peace in Ukraine. The measure came on the 4th anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion, but the United States again abstained, one of 51 countries to do so. President Zelensky has thanked the more than 100 countries that passed the resolution. The conflict has now entered its 5th year.
1107 against 12. Abstentions 51. Draft resolution A/ES11/L17 is adopted.
The United States welcomes, of course, the call for an immediate ceasefire. As we've said, this resolution also includes language that is likely to distract from ongoing negotiations rather than support discussion of the full range of diplomatic avenues that may pave the way to that durable peace. For this reason, the United States called for a vote on OP2 and on the two paragraphs, and ultimately chose to abstain on the resolution. What is needed now to end the war is political will. We believe we are closer to a deal than at any point since this war began. Let this be the last anniversary of an ongoing war that has continued for far too long and at far too great a cost. Let's end it now.
And that's the Deputy Representative of the United States to the UN there, Tammy Bruce. Well, for more on this, I'm joined now on the line from London by the author and international affairs analyst, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz. Good to see you, Dr. Laskiewicz. So the UN General Assembly has spoken clearly in support of Ukraine's sovereignty, but how meaningful is that support when major powers, including the United States, choose to abstain?
It's virtually worthless, to be honest. The central problem is the UN is a toothless organization, and as a result, it simply cannot do anything with this resolution. It's rather a sort of pious hope. A classic example, of course, is with Israel, which holds the record, having most resolutions passed against it, to absolutely zero effect. And I do mention this term, zero. It therefore follows that it's good for Ukraine. It shows that there's level of support. I was far more interested in the fact that 51 abstained. That's roughly 1/3 of all the nations abstained. USA is the most obvious, but it does show that the level of lack of support for Ukraine is much higher than is given by the impression one has when reading Western media. And so that is actually a more worrying and more interesting aspect of this vote.
Well, I'm going to come to that very important point that you raised of the number of countries that abstained, but I wonder whether you managed to cock an ear to President Trump's State of the Union speech to Congress, because the Ukrainians seem particularly disappointed that he only used about 10 words, or about a sentence and a half, on Ukraine, especially given that it is the 4th anniversary of the war. I mean, what are your thoughts on the fact that he seemed to spend no more than one breath on Ukraine?
Well, there's a positive aspect to this. Actually, he can't say too much if the negotiations are serious, which in his view they are, because he might prejudice, and this is the more negative one. It's not clear he is particularly a supporter of Ukraine. And therefore, as a result, the reason why he hasn't said anything is because he is not going to actually condemn Russia, because he doesn't want to. And so for both these reasons, that's why he said so little.
And of course, meanwhile, 4 years on, Russia remains entrenched. I mean, are we now looking at a frozen conflict scenario, or is there still a credible path to a decisive outcome in your assessment?
That is a very good point. It really depends on how far Russia is prepared to go. Russia has a great many nukes. It has a great deal of force, which is non-conventional. If they were to go non-conventional, they could make a breakthrough. Obviously, they regard Ukrainians as their fellow Russians, so they're unlikely to do this. That's why I said Poland would be the first such battlefield. But were they to take such action, they could certainly break the deadlock and certainly could do something. As things stand on conventional forces alone, it doesn't appear to be the case that there's a victory for Russia anywhere in the offing. And in fact, they're not really thinking in terms of conquering Ukraine, simply getting as far as taking the whole of the Donbass, because President Putin has actually nailed his colors to the mast there and said he must have this, which means he can't really walk away from that. But to go to your question, he's unlikely to take the whole of Donbass anywhere in the near future. And therefore, from that point of view, it is a stalemate at present in many ways.
Let me just return to the vote in the General Assembly and your point earlier about the abstentions. With over 50 countries abstaining, are we witnessing the rise of a more non-aligned world order where countries are increasingly unwilling to take sides? And if so, what does this say about the influence of institutions like the UN in resolving modern conflicts? Although I think you answered that second part earlier.
The UN really is not very good at resolving. All it ever does is simply provides a forum for discussion, important in its own right, but scarcely decisive. It provides a way of making troops turn up as peacekeepers without any bias to one side or the other, which is also important, but unlikely to work in this scenario. And so the UN, from that point of view, is relevant. The interesting aspect is, if you look at the against and the abstentions, it's an awful lot of countries which aren't on Ukraine's side. And that, I think, is the most worrying feature for Ukraine. So 107 in favor, sure, but he had that last year and the year before, because he used to call these conferences and have many, many nations turning up. I think actually he made a mistake even in being in favor of such a vote, because actually it's on the whole favorable to Russia as it stands.
And interestingly, many African countries chose abstention. I mean, why do you reckon the global south is increasingly reluctant to fully back Ukraine? I mean, is this about neutrality, economic interests, or skepticism towards Western narratives?
Yeah, actually, I would give a tick to all three boxes there. There's no question that many people in the world are skeptical. I mean, you've only got to look at 9/11, which was the justification for attacking Afghan, which almost certainly was a false flag incident. You've only got to look at how the West is forever, if you like, doing what it likes, especially America, with its own narrative, which is sometimes totally irrelevant or just simply a false flag, like the weapons of mass destruction on Iraq. And for that matter, it's simply a way of just keeping up West dominance, which is the attack on Libya, which was about Libya's attempt to set up a dinar, a gold currency, which would run outside the dollar. So yes, there's nothing in it for Africa. The Western narrative is suspect, and as usual, one has to unfortunately say, and for all those reasons, it is non-aligned. And to be honest, that's probably the best in its economic interest, because there doesn't seem to be much point in joining the side or Ukraine side for the Africans.
Well, stay with us, Dr. Laskiewicz. Let me get your very quick and brief assessment of this next story. The German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, is in Beijing for his first visit to China since he became Chancellor 10 months ago. He's met the Chinese Premier Li Qiang and has been holding talks with President Xi Jinping, with representatives signing agreements on climate change and food security. Earlier, Mr. Merz emphasized the need for fair competition and jointly agreed rules with China, Germany's biggest trading partner. The visit comes as German businesses are sounding the alarm about the trade imbalance between the two countries. Mr. Merz also said he would discuss Beijing's influence over Moscow with President Xi. And of course, Dr. Laskiewicz is still with us, the author and international affairs analyst. He's on the line from London. What do you make of this visit?
Yeah, he certainly set up with a very ambitious plan. But unfortunately, nothing is going to come out of it. China has a trade imbalance. Actually, it is as good or as bad, I suppose, depending from Germany's point of view, as it's ever been. And that's most unlikely the Chinese are going to do anything about that. As for China's influence over Russia, I really think this is a Western myth. China certainly has, if you like, a dialogue with Russia. But to say that China can tell Russia what to do or steer it, I think is going far too far. As for the climate stuff, to be quite honest, I don't see much effort from the Chinese about climate, although they have started to do some greenwashing about planting trees in the desert some recently. But notice the elephant in the room, Taiwan. Nothing said about Taiwan. And the reason why is, of course, because Europe has got nothing to say on the matter. If China takes it, it takes it. If it doesn't, it doesn't. It's America which counts 100%. Here, Europe is irrelevant. Then it gets a little bit worse than that. If he's thinking of going to China, is he more on the Chinese side? For example, about Taiwan? Where does Germany stand? Because at the beginning part of the war with Ukraine, Germany was actually more on Russia's side. It actually was apparently stated that it's a pity Ukraine just didn't surrender. China is now Germany's biggest partner because they can't trade with Russia. And this is by no means what the Germans really like. So on the whole, I don't think much will come of this visit. And in fact, it's simply underlined how weak Europe is by not mentioning places like Taiwan.
Dr. Laskiewicz, thank you ever so much, as always. Dr. Marek Laskiewicz is the author and international affairs analyst talking to me on the line from London.